What is up, Flutter devs? Today we're talking about Flutter versus the web. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, wait a second, doesn't Flutter run on the web? And yes, it does, but it also kind of depends what you mean when you say the web. Specifically today, what we're talking about is user interfaces versus documents. And let me tell you what I'm talking about. Now, if we talk about TCP, IP, and HTTP, if you consider that to be part of the web, and it is part of the web, it's an important part of the web, but if that's what you think of when you think of the web, those things are great. We all use TCP, IP, and HTTP, even in our Android apps, our iOS apps, our desktop apps. That part of the web is everywhere. It does an excellent job. What I'm talking about is when we create the dumpster on top of it, known as HTML plus CSS. This is where things start to go off the rails. You see, HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. It's not a user interface markup language. It's not an application markup language. It's a hypertext markup language. Hypertext just means hyperlinked text. It means text that can link to other text at other URLs. That's hypertext, all right? HTML is textual, content-based markup. And along with HTML, you can ship to the browser something called CSS, cascading style sheets. Now, the cascading part aside, what is a style sheet? Where does that come from? It comes from the world of print. Magazines historically have made heavy use of style sheets. I'm sure newspapers have as well. Style sheets say when you want this kind of header, it should use this font, it should be this size, it should have this leading, this line spacing. When you want a paragraph, here's the font, here's the line height, all of those kinds of details. Knowing which of those details to apply where based on the kind of content, the semantic meaning of your content, that is what a style sheet does. Again, magazines, newspapers, the print world. So HTML plus CSS is essentially the print world online. And HTML and CSS happen to be our transport formats, the official transport formats for the browser-based web. But these, again, if it's just a transport format, you can escape it, right? If you don't want to deal with HTML, okay, maybe you ship a bunch of JavaScript and you ignore the HTML. But where this thing goes from a dumpster to a dumpster fire is when we bring in the document object model, otherwise known as the DOM. The document object model is essentially the central rendering monolith for the entire browser window. Everything that your website or web app displays, every detail about how it renders and why, it comes from that document object model. You can't escape that. That is the official web standards browser-based API for doing all visual things in the window. Let me show you what I mean. Here we have just a few random examples of JavaScript that you might write against the fundamental browser APIs. Let's say you want to query, you want to get a hold of a photo. You say document.getElementById. If you want to grab the paragraphs, you say document.querySelectorAll. If you want to add a header to the document, to the window, you say document create element. That gives you an element. Then you say document.create text node. That's where you put the text for the header. You put the text node into the heading element, and then you say document.body.append child. Everything we're doing here is document centric. Again, what we're not seeing is app dot. We're not seeing user interface dot. We're not seeing things that correspond to what we are probably building. Literally, the fundamental foundational APIs assume and behave as if everything in the browser window is a document. So you put these three pieces together, and here we have them. Over on the left, you have your hypertext markup language, which is essentially tags that you place around headers, subheaders, titles, images, paragraphs, list items, all the things that you might find in a term paper, a newspaper, or a magazine, those are the things that we're marking up here. We are describing the document content semantics of what we're sending to the browser. And then along with it, we might send a style sheet that says, hey, browser, when you parse all of our marked up content, we would like for you to render it with these various properties. We want the headers to look like this, the paragraphs to look like this, etc. And then finally, you can write some JavaScript in the browser where once again, everything is based on this concept of document. That document is a global object available as soon as the browser has loaded up your web page or your web app. And so you can see how everything related to the origin of the browser-based web is document-centric. It's not app-centric. It's not user interface or user experience-centric. It is document-centric, okay? This is what the browser really is. We use it very differently, but fundamentally the browser is like a different flavor of a PDF reader with a URL bar stuck at the top. The browser is like you putting in a web address and loading up a PDF. In the history of the web is essentially the longest lasting, most successful hack in history. Because the web has essentially turned a PDF document into an interactive user experience. Not necessarily a good one, but the web has managed to contort the concept of a document. I mean, imagine taking a technology that was intended to organize your term papers. So you're back in university, you have to put together your thesis paper. That tool that you use to organize your thesis paper, to lay it all out, to give it the right fonts and spacing and footnotes, you take that tool and you create Spotify. That's essentially what the web has done. And I have to credit the gazillion people who have worked on the web to make that possible, though I'd like to point out the reason a gazillion people have had to work on the web is because it's a history of essentially turning a document renderer into a user interface system. You know, back in the day, this is what some earlier versions of websites looked like. And you'll notice that most of these details make a lot of sense from a document perspective, but aren't necessarily optimal for the particular user interface. There's a lot of plain text laid out in a very simple fashion. There's relatively little ornamentation based around what the user interface can do. I mean, obviously, these are two very different time periods here. We have the earliest of Amazon, and this version of YouTube probably, I mean, I'm not sure what year this is from. Any time between 2005 to 2010 wouldn't shock me. Somewhere in there, maybe. But still, most of it's very simple textual content. One interesting thing you'll notice, though, is that in this YouTube screenshot, we have those tabs at the top. And that's an interesting example of a hack. I mean, the web does not have any concept of a menu bar, an app bar, or tabs. So what you have here is you have text that is given some kind of padding around the text, and then given a gradient background behind the text with the padding. And then when you tap it, the JavaScript yanks a bunch of the document out and replaces it with a different document, and it looks like what you've done is switch pages. So this is the beginning of the evolution of hacking the web. This is why for so many years, if any of you remember the late 90s, early 2000s of web development, every website was using tables for everything. Now, tables, some of you who are used to web, you might say, yeah, what's wrong with that? Well, tables were intended for tabular data. They were intended for spreadsheet kind of stuff. They weren't layout tools. It was a semantic tool for tabular data. But because the presentation of tabular data had layout rules that everybody wanted to use for non-table things, suddenly your whole website was one big table. Now, semantically, that's a huge lie. It's a massive hack. But that's what many people were reduced to doing because there was this document layout system and nobody really wanted to lay out documents. They wanted to lay out user interfaces. Now, interestingly, if I bring up Grooveshark here, This Grooveshark screenshot probably comes from sometime not too long after the YouTube screenshot, but you'll notice that it immediately has this much more modern user interface. And how is that possible? Well, for most of Grooveshark's time, now they've long since been sued out of existence, but when Grooveshark was around, for most of its history, it was a Flash website, a Flash experience. And what is it about Flash that would allow you to make things look fundamentally different, fundamentally more like a modern user interface instead of some of these older, more archaic looking websites? Well, Flash did exactly what Flutter is doing today, and we'll talk about this in a moment. You see, Flash was a plugin, which meant it was not limited to HTML, CSS, or the document object model. Now, some people might point out that Flash used ActionScript instead of JavaScript, but the language is not what's important. What's important is the fundamental APIs. So in JavaScript in the browser, you're doing everything with the document object model. But if you send your Flash website over to the browser, you're not using the document object model. You're using the Flash-based APIs, which were not document-centric. They were canvas-centric. They were XY position, width, height, color, shape-centric. They were fundamental building blocks for painting and interaction, which is what allows for the relatively easy creation of what looks like a modern user interface. This is why I loved Flash back in the day, and so did many other developers, even though it had plenty of security holes and people were upset with that. But obviously, the web could not stay the way it was. Developers were miserable. Many web developers are still miserable, but they were especially miserable back then. And so obviously, since those, whether it's the 90s or the early 2000s, we've come a long way since then in the experiences. And now whether you go to Amazon or YouTube or Spotify, what you're looking at does look and feel a lot more like a user interface as opposed to a document. But here's the crazy thing. For the most part, with relatively few exceptions, these user interfaces that you're looking at right here, they are still documents. We have contorted documents into generic user interfaces. In other words, we've done this. The web began with a very narrow set of use cases, a very narrow set of concerns. The web was about documents, transporting, laying out, styling, rendering, interacting with documents, hypertext documents. That early web was not intended for, designed for, or optimized for mass commercial usage as an application substrate. Obviously, though, that's what the web has become. That's what we all use it for. So this very narrow set of use cases have been pushing ever more in every direction to try to fill up all possible user interfaces. But of course, as I showed you in the JavaScript, the most fundamental APIs are still document-centric. It's not like the web said, okay, we're going to create new fundamental APIs that have nothing to do with documents. The web said, we're just going to keep pushing the boundaries of what a document is until one day you can't distinguish between a document and a user interface. And this is why so much of web development has been and continues to be so painful. This is why there's a website called CSS Hacks. Like, hacking is a daily requirement in the world of web because you're making a document, well, you're making your user interface comprise itself of a document. You're making document APIs do non-document things. It's an unnatural goal all the time. That's why almost nothing on the web feels like you're supposed to actually do what it is that you're doing. It's why everything's a hack. It's also why things like React.js, Vue.js, Angular, the Polymer work, all of those things are really popular because they have found ways to hide the document nature of the web. They pretend like you're working with application user interfaces, generic user interfaces, when under the surface, they're still doing DOM manipulation. And that's why for the last 30 years, the web has felt like this, a bunch of under construction signs. not only is the web perpetually trying to fit a square peg into a round hole, but all of those hacks, even when a hack becomes official, even when CSS or HTML or the DOM changes, it still requires like years of proposals going through international regulatory bodies and getting all sorts of approvals. It's this massive process. By the time a given improvement is delivered on the web, they're already 5 years behind where they want to be. It's a never-ending cycle, and I've just always hated it. I haven't been a professional web developer at any point, but I've done enough web development. I've been aware enough of these details to stay away from it, and it's always irritated me when I had to go do something on the web, even if it wasn't as a professional endeavor. So with all of that said about web, explaining the document-centric nature of the web, let's just quickly remind ourselves of what Flutter actually is. Okay, let's talk about Flutter. In Flutter, we are not dealing with a document-centric API. We are dealing with a generic user interface toolkit. We deal with X and Y positions. We deal with width. We deal with height. We deal with fill colors. We deal with shapes, border radius, borders, outlines, these kinds of things. We also deal with things like an app bar. And when we want an app bar, this is not a div with an absolute position. This is just an app bar. We call it an app bar. We call it what it is because it's made to do what it actually does. It's not a hack. And we can throw in some generic layouts like a row. And with that row, we can fill some rectangles with a color. And there's nothing more to it. We don't need to pretend, we don't need to write HTML where we pretend that our horizontal layout here is some kind of term paper document. And then the second we get it into JavaScript or CSS, we make it look like decoration or layout. We have floating action buttons. Here again, this is not some div that's pulled out of the flow of the algorithm and given some absolute position. We have a widget called floating action button that you can provide to a scaffold in the floating action button property because Flutter is a user interface toolkit. It is not a document toolkit. But then that begs the question, what about documents? What about documents in Flutter? There's nothing wrong with documents. And I want to make that clear. My point here is not that documents are unnecessary or that they have no place. Obviously, documents have a major place on the web. There is a reason the web began with documents. Every blog post is a document. Every news article is a document. We have plenty of documents. My point about the web, the browser experience, is that the entire fundamental API is a document, and yet we want to do many things on the web that are not merely documents. The great thing about Flutter, though, when you begin with the big picture, when you have a user interface toolkit, all user interfaces are possible, and documents are a type of user interface. So not all user interfaces are documents, but all documents are user interfaces, and Flutter is a user interface toolkit, which means we can absolutely present documents in Flutter, but there are some details that we should discuss. Obviously, we can render text in Flutter. We've all done that before, whether in a document form or in a button or in a menu or in an app bar. We can select text in Flutter. If you use a selectable text widget, you can drag to select. If you use a text field, you can drag to select. However, you can't drag a selection from one paragraph to another if they're different widgets. Now, if you just put a blank line into a selectable text widget, then sure. But if you have two text widgets one after the other, or two selectable text widgets one after the other, there is no automatic selection of text across those paragraphs. Furthermore, while we can certainly display images, we can't select images with text. There's just no concept currently in Flutter to cover that. So things are possible. There's nothing, like we don't have to go petition a regulatory body to have documents in Flutter, but we do need more than what is currently available. In fact, Flutter fully acknowledges this. If you go to the Flutter website and you look at what is documented for Flutter web apps, one thing that you will read says, not every HTML scenario is ideally suited for Flutter at this time. For example, text-rich, flow-based static content, such as blog articles, benefit from the document-centric model that the web is built around. And that is true. Given the web was essentially created for documents, the web is very good at document things. Flutter was created for all user interfaces in general. So Flutter will, over time, create specialized solutions, but Flutter is still relatively young. It doesn't have specialized solutions for everything yet, and documents are one of those things for which Flutter does not yet have a specialized solution. And this is understood. You can find various issues filed about this. Here we're dealing with selection across multiple widgets. Here there's a suggestion to make all text selectable. I don't think all text should be selectable, by the way, but that's one thing that's been proposed. And here's again dealing with selection around text bounds. Now there is one thing I want to say about these issues though. There's a lot of discussion about what you can and cannot do currently with text in Flutter. And I fully understand and appreciate those limitations, and those limitations do need to be fixed. We need to be able to get past those limitations. But to pretend, I think some people have convinced themselves that this is a text problem. It's not a text problem. It's a document user interface problem. It's a document problem. Flutter does not have specialized support for documents. And again, that's fine. We all understand why it's not there yet. But we can't go solve the text problems alone. That's not going to do it. As soon as we solve the issues with text, then we're going to need to solve, we're going to be like, oh, actually, this wasn't just about text. What about, list items, images, horizontal rules, and all this other document stuff? But this is where we are right now with Flutter. So the web is very document-centric. Flutter is all about any given user interface you can think of, which includes documents, but Flutter does not yet ship with the fundamental tools that we need to actually work with documents. That's Flutter versus the web right now. In the next video, I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about why Flutter doesn't support documents yet, and I'm going to tell you how I would solve that problem if I were to solve it. So join me in the next video for that, and we'll continue our conversation of documents in Flutter.